Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, today we're unpacking a fascinating and, honestly, totally overlooked historical mystery. Picture this. It's the 1930s. The U.S. is finally clawing its way out of the absolute darkest depths of the Great Depression. Recovery is actually in the air, people are finally getting back to work, and then boom, the floor just completely falls out again, the economy crashes hard. So what on earth went wrong just as things were looking up? Today, we're going to dig into the data, read the room of the 1930s, and uncover the dual diagnosis behind this massive economic whiplash.
So quick question for you. Have you ever even heard of America's third worst economic downturn of the 20th century? I mean, we all know the 1929 crash, right? And we definitely remember the big recessions of recent history. But hiding right there, squarely in the shadow of the Great Depression, is this terrifying, lightning-fast collapse that kicked off in May of 1937. Economists actually call it the recession within the depression.
To wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this thing, let's look at the numbers. And honestly, this first stat is just absolutely staggering. In the span of just over a year, real gross domestic product dropped by a massive 10%. 10%! That is a gigantic contraction of the nation's entire economic output. It literally wiped out years of hard-fought recovery just like that.
But, it wasn't just numbers on a ledger. This had a truly devastating human cost. Unemployment had been steadily, thankfully, going down since 1933. But then, it violently reversed course. By June of 1938, the unemployment rate shot back up to a heartbreaking 20%. 1 in 5 American workers suddenly out of a job, right when they thought the absolute worst was finally behind them.
And manufacturing? Oh, it took the hardest hit by far. Industrial production went into a total freefall, plummeting by 32% in just 13 months. I mean, that completely erased the manufacturing gains of the previous 3 years, dragging production all the way back to 1934 levels. This sudden, violent crash has made historians and economists really scrutinize the policies of the time. And what they've found points to a dual diagnosis. So, let's jump into the first part of that diagnosis, the policy choices.
Okay, to understand the first major theory behind this crash, we've got to talk about excess reserves. By definition, excess reserves are simply the money above the amount that banks are legally required to hold as a fraction of their customers' deposits. Now, back in the mid-1930s, banks were absolutely terrified of another banking panic, right? So what did they do? They hoarded cash. Excess reserves blew up from about $500 million in 1933 to over $3.3 billion by late 1935. The Federal Reserve saw this giant growing mountain of idle cash and, well, they started sweating about future inflation.
Okay, let's dive into exactly what happened next, because the government essentially slammed on the economic brakes from multiple directions all at once. First, the Fed literally doubled reserve requirements to soak up all those excess reserves we just talked about. This basically yanked liquidity right out of the banking system. At the exact same time, the Treasury Department started sterilizing gold inflows, which kept new gold from expanding the money supply. And on the fiscal side, the very first Social Security payroll taxes hit workers' paychecks in 1937, right alongside some really steep tax hikes from the Revenue Act of 1935. It was this severe, simultaneous tightening of macroeconomic policy that just choked the recovery.
But here's the thing. Macroeconomic tightening, that's really only half the story. There's a second, equally crucial diagnosis. If you look at the tracking of gross private investment alongside gross domestic product, something weird stands out. GDP starts recovering pretty steadily after 1933. But private investment, it just flatlines. It stays incredibly low, practically bumping along the absolute bottom. Businesses just flat out stop making long-term investments.
Let's put that investment collapse into perspective, because it's wild. Back in 1929, net private investment was a very healthy positive $8.3 billion. But check out the next decade. If you tally up the total net private investment for the entire 11-year stretch from 1930 to 1940, the number is negative $3.1 billion. Think about that. For an entire decade, businesses weren't even replacing the basic machinery and buildings that were wearing out, let alone trying to expand.
So why on earth would businesses completely stop investing for a decade? Well, that brings us to diagnosis number 2, regime uncertainty. This is a hypothesis that economic historians use to explain the dragging duration of the Depression. It's basically this pervasive, nagging doubt among investors about the security of their property rights and the prospective returns on their capital. Put simply, investors were just way too scared of what the government might do next to actually risk their money.
And if you want to understand why they were so spooked, you really just have to look at the legislative record. Between 1933 and 1940, Congress passed an absolute mountain of major acts. We're talking massive, sweeping changes: the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Wagner Act empowering labor unions, the Wealth Tax of 1935, the creation of the SEC, and seriously aggressive antitrust enforcement. Now, regardless of how you might view the social merits of these programs today, from a purely historical and economic perspective back then, this rapid-fire succession of heavy regulations and new taxes profoundly changed the rules of the game for private businesses almost overnight.
And this massive legislative shift came with some highly charged political rhetoric, too. During the 1936 campaign, President Franklin D. Roosevelt openly criticized corporate leaders and wealthy investors, calling them economic royalists. In one really major speech, he famously declared, "I should like to have it said of my second administration that in it these forces met their master." So this escalating super public tension between the administration and the business community created an environment where corporate leaders felt actively targeted, and that really set the stage for total investment paralysis.
To really humanize this whole regime uncertainty thing, just listen to what actual business leaders were saying at the time. In 1937, major industrialist Lamont DuPont said, "Uncertainty rules the tax situation, the labor situation, the monetary situation. Are taxes to go higher, lower, or stay where they are? We don't know. Is labor to be union or non-union? It is impossible to even guess at the answers." You can literally hear the genuine paralysis in his words. When there's zero predictability, capital stays locked tight in the vault.
Now, what's really fascinating is just how deep that fear actually ran. Back in November of 1941, Fortune magazine polled business executives, basically asking, what do you predict the post-war American economy is going to look like? The results? Astounding. Almost 90% of these executives expected either a semi-socialized society or a straight-up government takeover of many services. Nearly 4% actually thought there'd be a complete economic dictatorship. Only 7.2% believed free enterprise would be restored. I mean, think about it. When the people holding the capital genuinely expect the total end of the free market, they are absolutely not going to invest.
And they definitely put their money where their mouth was. When investors are scared of the future, they demand huge risk premiums to lock up their money long-term. Just look at the relative yield on high-grade corporate bonds. You see these dramatic, massive spikes between 1936 and 1941. The yield on a 30-year bond was actually more than 5 times higher than a 1-year bond. This right here is hard, undeniable financial data, proving that investors were utterly terrified of committing capital to the distant future during those specific years.
All right, so we've got our dual diagnosis laid out. But the big question is, how did the economy finally break free from all this? Well, that brings us to our resolution, the Great Escape.
The answer really lies in a gradual changing of the political guard. Starting in 1940, with World War II looming on the horizon, FDR realized he desperately needed industrial output. So he enlisted thousands of business executives to manage the war mobilization. Suddenly, corporate America had a seat at the table again. Then, in 1945, Harry Truman took over, replacing many of the most ardent New Deal planners with centrists. On top of that, a conservative coalition in Congress successfully blocked any further expansion of New Deal programs. So by 1946, that looming threat of an economic regime change had largely evaporated, and confidence finally started to return.
And the result of this shift? Completely undeniable. During the war years with massive government spending, private investment was basically non-existent. But jump to 1946. As wartime controls were finally lifted and belief in the system came back, private investment just exploded right back to 1929 levels. The capital was finally flowing again. This huge post-war investment boom is the true Great Escape that effectively powered the United States into decades of sustained prosperity.
So, what does all this actually mean for us today? Well, the events of 1937 offer a super powerful dual lesson. First off, we see the extreme danger of premature macroeconomic tightening. When the Fed and the Treasury pulled money out of the system way too early, it absolutely choked the recovery. And second, we see the totally paralyzing economic effect of business and property right uncertainty. You just cannot have a robust, growing economy if the private sector is literally too afraid to invest its capital. Combine those two things, and you've got the perfect economic storm.
So I want to leave you with this thought. You know they say history rarely repeats itself exactly, but it often rhymes, right? Looking at our world right now, what should modern policymakers learn from 1937 about the massive dangers of withdrawing economic support too quickly, or stifling long-term business confidence. It is incredibly tricky to find that perfect balance, but as history clearly shows us, getting it wrong can bring the entire economy to a grinding halt. Thanks for exploring this historical mystery with me in this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep learning.